Star Trek Strange New Worlds wants you to believe the strangest thing that happened aboard the Enterprise in Season 4 was just a dream. Spock wakes up, T'Pring is human, the crew is back to normal, and everything looks fine. Except there is one problem sitting right there in Spock's room. Little Ricky. The same puppet Scotty used moments before the transporter accident. The same puppet that disappeared when the transporter went haywire. The same puppet connected to the bizarre reality Spock supposedly imagined. So why is it still there? And that raises a much bigger question. What if Spock didn't dream the puppet Enterprise? What if his brain was trying to remember something that actually happened? Because look at what we were shown. The Enterprise disappears. Spock is the only person who remains human. The crew suddenly obeys a completely different set of physical rules. They survive in space. They don't need oxygen. Pelia can be cut in half and survive. Pike can be thrown into an airlock and come back knocking on the window. And somehow, after all of this, we're supposed to believe Spock's unconscious mind simply made the whole thing up. No, I think the episode is hiding something. The puppet world was real. Maybe not exactly the way Spock experienced it. Maybe the transporter pushed the Enterprise somewhere it was never supposed to go, and Spock's unconscious mind translated that impossible reality into a nightmare made of felt and stuffing. And if that's true, then Little Ricky isn't the punchline at the end of the episode. He's the evidence. The episode begins innocently enough, at least by Strange New World standards. Scotty is experimenting with the transporter, trying to extend its range, and instead of volunteering a perfectly good piece of equipment, or, I don't know, a test dummy, he decides to use his childhood puppet, Little Ricky. Spock immediately looks suspicious of the thing, and honestly, for once, his Vulcan instincts are doing exactly what they should. Scotty activates the transporter, Little Ricky disappears, alarms go off, and suddenly something has gone horribly wrong. Spock is away from the Enterprise at the time, but when he returns, the ship appears normal for about 5 seconds. Then, he discovers the truth. Everyone is a puppet. Pike is a puppet. Lon is a puppet. Uhura is a puppet. Pelia is a puppet. Even T'Pring has somehow been turned into a Vulcan puppet, which is probably the one situation she specifically requested Starfleet avoid when she agreed to come aboard. But Spock is completely normal. That detail is easy to laugh at because the episode is designed to be ridiculous. But it may actually be the first piece of evidence that something much stranger happened to the Enterprise. Because why Spock? If this were simply a random transporter malfunction, why does the accident affect everyone aboard the Enterprise except the one person who wasn't physically on the ship when it happened? Spock is outside. He's returning from his shuttle. He's separated from the Enterprise at exactly the moment the transporter experiment goes wrong. That makes him different from everyone else in a very important way. He isn't part of the transformation. He's an observer standing outside it. And that could explain why he later experiences the entire event differently. The official explanation is that Spock was knocked unconscious and dreamed everything. Fine, that's possible. Spock is already under tremendous emotional pressure. Layan has just ended their relationship. He's still processing what happened aboard the Griffin. He's struggling with anxiety and trying to reconnect with T'Pring. If you wanted to design the perfect conditions for a bizarre stress dream, Spock has basically checked every box. But then we get to the first major problem with the dream explanation. The puppet world has rules. The crew isn't randomly behaving like cartoon characters. Their bodies follow a consistent physical logic. Their fingers don't work with the Enterprise controls. They can't operate weapons normally. They can be damaged without suffering normal biological consequences. They can survive without oxygen. They can float through space. They can even use their ridiculous bodies strategically during the battle with the Orions. Pelia can be sliced in half and simply wait for Chapel to sew her back together. Pike can be blown into space and survive. Eventually, the crew realizes that their puppet bodies aren't just a curse. They're an advantage. That's important, because dreams usually don't need rules. But this one has them. It has limitations, consequences, and a physical environment that remains consistent even when Spock isn't around. And that's where the theory starts getting interesting. What if Spock weren't inventing the puppet world? What if his unconscious mind was translating an actual event into something he could understand? Think about what Scotty was actually doing. He wasn't casually testing the transporter. He was pushing it beyond its normal range. And transporters in Star Trek aren't exactly harmless machines. They break a person down, convert that pattern into energy and information, and reconstruct them elsewhere. We've seen transporter accidents do some very strange things throughout Trek history. So what happens when you deliberately push the technology further than it's supposed to go? Maybe you don't just get a failed transport. Maybe you create an unstable state where matter doesn't behave normally. Maybe the Enterprise is temporarily displaced into some kind of subspace distortion. Maybe the transporter pattern becomes disconnected from the normal rules of matter. And if something like that happened, Spock's brain would have to make sense of an experience that doesn't make sense. So it uses the only thing available. Little Ricky. The transporter experiment begins with a puppet. Spock's mind turns the entire experience into puppets. Suddenly, the ridiculousness has a purpose. The puppet bodies may not represent what the crew literally looked like. They may represent what happened to them on a molecular or quantum level. Their bodies no longer behave like normal biological organisms, which is why they don't need oxygen. They can survive damage. They can float through space. They can be torn apart and repaired, and the Enterprise itself becomes this strange environment where the normal rules of physics are bent just enough to make everything possible. Now look at the space scene again. At first, it's just charming. The crew goes outside the ship and floats through the stars. There's something genuinely beautiful about it. These characters are usually protected from the emptiness of space by technology. Now they're just out there, drifting around together like the universe has temporarily decided to stop being dangerous. It's funny, it's sweet. It's one of the few moments where the absurd premise actually becomes magical. But if the puppet world were real, that scene becomes something else entirely. It means the crew really experienced a physical state where they no longer needed oxygen. And that's huge. Because if the transporter had simply knocked Spock unconscious, none of those physical rules would mean anything. But if the transporter temporarily altered the crew's physical state, suddenly everything we saw has a possible explanation. The comedy becomes a disguise for a genuine science fiction mystery. And then we have Little Ricky. This is the part one can't get past. Little Ricky is there before the accident. Little Ricky is the test subject. Little Ricky disappears during the transporter malfunction. The puppet nightmare follows. And when Spock wakes up, Little Ricky is back in the real world. Why? If Spock's entire experience was nothing more than a dream, then Little Ricky's appearance at the end is just a cute callback. Scotty thinks giving Spock the puppet will make him feel better. Spock stares at it like he's looking at the physical manifestation of everything he just suffered through. But the writers could have ended this completely differently. They could have had Spock wake up, talk to T'Pring, realize it was all a dream, and laugh. Instead, they put Little Ricky in the room. The one object connected to the transporter accident is now sitting beside Spock after the nightmare is supposedly over. That doesn't prove Little Ricky is alive. I'm not going to pretend he's secretly going to start talking in the next episode. Although, considering what this show has already done, I wouldn't completely rule it out. But it does make Little Ricky feel like an anchor. Something connects the beginning of the accident to the ending, and the title makes this even more interesting. The episode isn't called Spock's Puppet Dream. It's called Level 5 Transporter Accident. The transporter accident is real. Spock really is affected. Spock really is knocked unconscious. The Enterprise really does disappear. So maybe the show is giving us two stories at once. There's the literal transporter accident that happens in reality, and then there's the strange puppet experience that Spock's mind creates while he is unconscious. But what if the second story isn't completely imaginary? What if it's a distorted memory of something that happened while the transporter system was unstable? That would explain why the dream feels so complete. It would also explain why Spock is the only person who remembers. Imagine this from the crew's perspective. They experience a transporter malfunction. Spock is knocked unconscious. Eventually, everything returns to normal. They wake up and continue their lives. Nobody remembers becoming a puppet. Nobody remembers fighting Orions. Nobody remembers going outside the ship without oxygen. Nobody remembers Pike being thrown into the airlock. But Spock does. Because Spock was the observer, he experienced the event from outside the normal state of reality. And perhaps that is why the episode spends so much time putting him under pressure. Everyone suddenly needs him. Uhura needs his hands. Scotty needs his help. Pike needs him to operate the ship. La'an needs him to solve problems. The entire Enterprise becomes dependent on Spock, and eventually he breaks down. He has a panic attack because he believes he has to save everybody. Then T'Pring tells him something he desperately needs to hear. He can't control everything. And that's where the emotional story and the science fiction mystery connect. Spock is trying to impose logic on a reality that has stopped behaving logically. The Enterprise is essentially a physical version of Spock's own mind. Everything is chaotic, nothing works the way it should. Everyone depends on him. And the only way he can survive is by accepting the chaos instead of fighting. That's why the final battle matters. The Orions capture Spock and demand the Enterprise's control codes. They use Pike as leverage and eventually throw him into the airlock. But Pike survives because the crew discovers that space can't kill puppets. Suddenly, their greatest weakness becomes their greatest advantage. Then, when Spock needs to retake the bridge, he doesn't solve the problem through some complicated Vulcan maneuver. He embraces the absurdity. He throws Pike toward Sherol, knocking her away from the captain's chair, and takes control. He shuts down life support and uses the Orions' own assumptions against them. And T'Pring tells him exactly what he needs to understand. The hijinks aren't the obstacle, they're the solution. That's the lesson Spock takes from the entire experience. But maybe the transporter accident was teaching him something too. Maybe Spock's subconscious didn't create this world, because nothing happened. Maybe it created the puppet world, because something happened that his conscious mind couldn't understand. And then he wakes up. T'Pring is human. The Enterprise is normal, the crew is normal, everything is fine. Except little Ricky is still there. That's why I don't think the ending completely closes the mystery. Maybe it really was a dream. But maybe it was a dream built from something real. Maybe Scotty accidentally pushed the transporter beyond its limits and temporarily displaced the Enterprise into an unstable state. Maybe the crew really did experience a bizarre physical transformation, and Spock's unconscious mind simply translated that experience into the language of a puppet nightmare. And if that's true, then the final shot becomes much more unsettling. Because Spock isn't just looking at a toy, he's looking at the one thing from the nightmare that survived. Maybe he's annoyed because he hates the puppet. Maybe he's embarrassed because he remembers the dream. Or maybe, somewhere deep inside that famously logical Vulcan brain, Spock knows something doesn't add up. The Enterprise came back. The crew came back. Reality came back. But little Ricky came back too. And that leaves us with the question the episode never really answers. What happened to the Enterprise between the moment Scotty activated that transporter and the moment Spock opened his eyes? Maybe Spock dreamed it. Maybe the transporter showed it to him. Or maybe, just maybe, the Enterprise really went somewhere and Spock was the only one who came back remembering it.